Bálint. Welcome to the Third Man podcast. So I'm really curious because we've known each other for a very long time over the internet now and become so familiar with the kind of conversations we have over that medium. What I want to know is maybe could you give us like some introduction of you based on your testimony, like based on how you really came to be a Christian, and maybe a little bit about how you've developed theologically over the years, because it seems like over the course of time you've gone through some pretty drastic changes in your philosophical outlook.
Okay, let's see. I got saved a bit more than 10 years ago when I was 14. I was raised as a Christian, but my parents kind of didn't want to force it upon me. At the age of like 13 or so, I didn't know a whole lot about Christianity, but I did have a memory of childhood faith or something like that. Then that time I was really into science. I was really into physics and chemistry, and I basically had a sort of something close to a naturalistic outlook. Like I wasn't a convinced naturalist, but I got this very strong intuition that things can be reduced to physical things. So when I was around 13 or 14, I kind of felt like I needed to decide if I was going to be a Christian or not, because that kind of determines how you're going to live from that point on. And a few things happened at the same time. So I kind of started questioning my thoughts about the sciences. Like I started asking what I would today call philosophy of science and metaphysics questions. Like, okay, fine, we understand the equation of gravity, but why is that the equation for gravity? We know the speed of light, but why is that the speed of light? And it's quite soon I realized that these kind of questions are not possible to be answered by science, which kind of reopened me again to like a fuller worldview. And at that time, somebody in my family was had been going to church, and so I asked to join, and I went to church, and then went to youth group, and I think that's where I was converted. When we had like small group prayer or something like that, I just sensed very strongly that this is the real deal, and I want to invest my life into this.
That's cool. So do you remember like what the specific prayer night was, or did this group like read some scripture or share some story that you remember, or is it more just you remember the feeling?
So this was a youth group meeting which involved like worship and a sermon and then small group prayer. That was the setting. And during prayer, I just had this extremely strong sense that like Jesus is here. It was like the most obvious thing to me then, and that's basically what made me decide to go on this road.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I remember someone interviewing me and asking me a question about whether when I'm praying I feel like I'm really talking with a person. And so it's very interesting to me that your testimony is like you went to this small group and it felt like Jesus was in the room. Do you still feel like that when you sit down and read or pray or consider God? Do you feel like that, like his presence is there?
Sometimes I feel like need to work through these layers that can sometimes cover this basic sense, like it's the custom thing, that the thing that we've been doing this for many years, the thing that I'm in the rush of the day and I just have 10 minutes or devote 10 minutes to do this. Sometimes these are kind of distractions that I think can cloud this clear sense that we, the best case scenario, can have.
Yeah, I think most Christians would feel that. Yeah. So okay, so that's interesting. I don't think that I remembered that you were very interested in the sciences, and then through your church had some experiences and you started asking questions. You didn't come from a Reformed background, right? So that kind of stuff where you got into contact with more Reformed thinkers, and I'm not sure if you still consider yourself a Calvinist, but you have considered yourself a Calvinist for a very long time. How did that sort of change come about?
Right. So when this conversion happened to me, my first thought was like, I'm gonna have to be able to defend and present this on an intellectual level as well. So that was like from the first day for me. I started kind of finding like material on the internet and YouTube and stuff, and so I very early started watching guys like William Lane Craig and others. But also pretty soon, like I was for some reason interested in Christian-Muslim debates, and so I came across James White, started watching The Dividing Line. He discussed many things there, and for a while I tried to avoid his material on Calvinism. I was something like an Arminian back then, but eventually I tried to think through the 5 points, and after a while I realized that I accept like 4.5 of them, and saw really no reason to deny that. So I don't consider it my mission to try to convince everyone, because I don't think, and I think this is one reason why I'm not best Calvinist, I don't think it has that many important implications over Arminianism, for example. In fact, I am wary of some implications that Christians tend to draw out from it. For example, like skepticism toward intercessory prayer, or the idea that we really cannot say much to someone who is an unbeliever, and after that person heard the gospel once, it's basically a done deal. Apparently, they aren't to act. Like I've seen such attitudes. Or maybe another one is when people try to explain why we should ignore the warning passages. So I kind of see these perversions that people derive from Calvinism that worry me. And therefore, while in the abstract I do believe in like comprehensive providence and irresistible grace, I don't tend to make a big deal out of it.
Interesting. What do you remember what it was that really convinced? Like you said, you were thinking through the 5 points. Do you remember like a specific moment or a passage or an argument from James White where you sort of had maybe like a Russell moment, great God in boots, I'm a Calvinist or something like that?
Oh, I didn't have such a moment. It was gradual for me. But for example, John Sticks made a big impact on me. And also, I think the realization that when I came upon counter arguments, all of them, not all of them, but the vast majority of them were emotional appeal.
That's interesting. I want to hold on to that because I think the place for emotions and what you might call empathy or emotional intelligence in conversations will come up later when I ask you about your ideas about epistemology of disagreement. But before we get there, what has led you to become more philosophically oriented in your studies? So it seems, now I can see, right, that you were very interested in science, and this led you to ask really philosophical questions. So this is it seems like you've been deeply intellectual in your personality and pursuits, even since you were a teenager. Is that what led you to philosophy, or how would you add to that? Or answer that question?
I got into philosophy through apologetics. So I was listening to guys like Craig, and stumbled upon blogs and after a few years papers and stuff like that. And I think presuppositionalism was also involved in, because presuppositionalism is very heavily philosophical. I think much more than like the evidential sort of apologetics, where it's the same kind of reasoning that you use in most other areas of your life. Presuppositionalism operates on a more abstract level. So I got into philosophy gradually through that, like reading guys like James Anderson and Michael Butler and William Lane Craig and people like that. And eventually or gradually I got interested in more and more things. I really enjoyed the podcast from Dale Tuggy back in the early years when it was mostly interviews, not his own arguments. Eventually I started wrestling with his own arguments, so that's how I think I got into like the philosophical theology aspect of stuff, and so on and so on.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because for those who don't know, Dale Tuggy is a Unitarian, so God sort of used your listening to skepticism about Orthodox Christianity to get you to a lot of the philosophical interests that you now have.
Yeah, I should also mention Alvin Planning. I'm not sure when I came across him first, but it was still in high school. And he made a big impact on me as well.
That's actually what I was going to ask you. Is do you remember what the first planting of material was that you got your teeth into?
It might have been some form of the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Okay, so I'm curious about that, because from my experience, my appreciation for that argument, for what it is, comes out of how big a problem naturalism is in the West. It's particularly rampant among like young new atheists, and you see people like that running all over the place on the internet. And so it becomes a very easily employed argument against those types of folks, giving them a reason to doubt that kind of worldview. But I imagine the climate is kind of different over there where you are. How would you describe finding that argument and then getting more into planting and putting to use his various ideas? Because I think you have a much more comprehensive implementation of planting as philosophy.
Well, I do think so. In my own thinking and in my close environment, I do think that the primary alternative to Christianity has been some sort of naturalism. Of course, so if you were to poll the whole country, you would probably not get that result, but kind of the more intellectual and philosophical sort of area, I think that's still the main alternative. If you have a third alternative, that's going to be something like relativism or postmodern skepticism, but it's hard to spend too much time on that. What was the question, Jimmy, again?
So I guess my curiosity is, you mentioned like here that this is kind of like your gateway into planting it, but it's obvious to me from reading stuff that you've written and having many conversations with you, you use so much more of planting as insights. He's really influenced a lot of your philosophy. How did it go from this gateway of this argument against naturalism to talking about basic beliefs and talking about religious epistemology, all just the broader Plantingian influence?
Okay, all right. So as best I can recall, after I've been a Christian for about 2 years, maybe, or maybe 3, I became a presuppositionalist, which lasted for 1 or 2 years. And when I concluded that it doesn't work, I felt like I needed a new theory, a new outlook on how does faith and reason relate, and how does faith work and stuff like that. And I was I was somewhat familiar with Plantinga's model, and I eventually became persuaded that it's at least something close to right, and that's so. After a while, that's what I went with.
Here you're talking about Reformed epistemology, right? Like this general kind of Christian foundationalism.
Yes, but a Christian foundationalism that says that Christian belief is need not be supported by argument.
Yeah, that's kind of it's from a Van Tilian perspective. That's almost well, it depends on how much you agree with Bonson, but that might not be very controversial. But that's a very controversial statement in the West. I know this is a really big question, but could you take us through your the thought processes where you were at one point you were kind of more inclined to presuppositionalism, but then you looked at some objections and that kind of led you to planting, and then maybe tell us about some of your reasoning about trying to synthesize your appreciation for Van Til and what you see as basically right or very close to right in planting. Can you take us through that thought process?
I can try. So when I was a Van Tilian, I thought that I could prove with certainty to anyone that Christianity was true. And eventually I concluded that that was not the case for a number of reasons. One of them is that most of these arguments only show that if I really want something else to be true, then I should also think that Christianity is true, like morality or knowledge or stuff like that. But that doesn't get me to the actual truth of Christianity. And the other is that, well, it's really hard to refute all the alternatives, and I didn't buy Van Tilian solutions arguing that we don't actually need to refute all the alternatives. So it was sort of a crisis actually for my faith back then. Like if you think you believe something and you can absolutely prove it, and then you realize you don't know how to prove it, and it's probably impossible to prove it conclusively, you gotta do something about that. And well, basically I guess I used what was available to me at that time, and I don't remember the exact chronology of it, but I thought that Plantinga was making a lot of good arguments, and I thought so I had the conviction from my presuppositionalist days that what we believe about God and about metaphysics in general has an impact on our epistemology, right? So I wasn't attracted to some kind of bare evidentialism. And this conviction that our worldview influences what we should believe about epistemology is, I think, most rigorously developed by Alvin Plantinga. Maybe some will say that it's still insufficient, but I think it does a lot of work in that area. And so I found a lot of sympathies because I still agreed with the basic worldview considerations and scriptural considerations behind Van Tillianism, but I didn't agree with its more ambitious parts, and I was unable to support my faith with the arguments that I thought didn't work. So I kind of saw that Plantinga was doing something similar that I saw as more tenable, and so I went on with that.
How would you clarify that? So you have this conviction that our metaphysical commitments and maybe some other of our basic moral and epistemological commitments or something like that, that shapes our epistemological paradigm. But what is it then from Plantinga that you think really works that out in a consistent way, or at least at the time thought, hey, we can find great progress for this basic Christian conviction in a lot of Plantinga's insights?
Right. So Plantinga argues that Plantinga is an externalist. He believes that whether some belief we have counts as knowledge depends on factors that are outside of us and that we don't even necessarily have access to. So he argues that a belief is a warrant which is needed for knowledge if it is produced by reliably functioning faculties that are designed to produce true beliefs or something like that. And he argues that if Christianity is true, then we have a cognitive faculty which God designed for us to form belief in him immediately upon some stimuli, not based on argument or evidence, but just some circumstances. And there's also a cognitive process which is somehow externally induced, which is the testimony of the Holy Spirit, which is analogous to a cognitive faculty, by which God produces beliefs in the core convictions of the Christian faith in us, similarly in an immediate way, not based on arguments and not inferentially. And so I think the practical consequences of these are that if you agree with this, if you agree with the conditional, if Christianity is true, then for these reasons Christian belief counts as knowledge and you are within your epistemic rights, as Plantinga likes to say, to believe it. And also you find yourself being a Christian, as I was, then there's nothing you should worry about epistemic. So I think that's Plantinga's basic model. It has this sort of modesty of just trying to defend the rationality of Christian faith and also placing the bar kind of low, right? So if you can tell this kind of story, then you're fine. And so some worry that apologetically this is not enough because you cannot criticize other worldviews. But Plantinga also has this defeater system in his epistemology. And the defeater is a belief which, if you accept, there's some other belief that you have that you will have to give up. So he says that, for example, his evolutionary argument against naturalism is a defeater, a specific kind of defeater for evolution of naturalism. And he also argues extensively that there are no good defeaters against Christian belief.
Okay, so I find this. I think that was an excellent rendition of what Plantinga puts forth, and I'm a little bit. It makes me laugh at myself because I remember for years running into people who had a vaguely Plantingian outlook, and it took me forever to understand how Plantinga was really trying to reshape our epistemological expectations. Like you're saying, he's going for a more modest outlook. No matter what I think about that now, what's interesting is that I'm wondering if it's what you're drawing on, and where you might go with bringing Van Til into this, is the idea that because you have these metaphysical convictions and they kind of shape your epistemology in some way. Like you might believe something as simple as your personhood remains the same across moments in time. Something as simple as that. And so you got to kind of build your epistemology to fit that conviction. Or like you said earlier, right? You had this kind of falling out with the idea that you could prove Christianity, and you had to do something about that. And so you've got to look for an epistemology that can work with that. How then would you? Because I know you have a paper on this. How then did you go about bringing Van Til to kind of try to synthesize Plantinga's externalism? What are the Van Tilian insights that you think kind of qualify or bring nuance to that?
Right. The story behind this is a bit funny because I was at a conference and I met a Reformed philosopher who really did not like Van Til. And So I'm not a Van Tillian, and I wasn't a Van Tillian back then either. But I also didn't thought that Van Til was like silly and should be ignored and didn't say anything interesting and stuff like that. So I wanted to explain to him the core convictions of Van Til in like modern epistemological categories, which I thought could be done, but I didn't have the time, and it hadn't been published anywhere by anyone. And so I kind of thought that I had I had a view which was kind of worth getting out. So I wrote a paper about it, and what I think is, what I argue in that paper is that there are some common themes in Van Til and Plantinga. There is this dialectic, right, in Van Til that in principle the unbeliever doesn't know or shouldn't know anything or couldn't know anything, but in fact he does on account of some inconsistency. And so Van Til formulated this in a way that that is quite distinct from contemporary epistemology. I think we can take Plantinga's categories and try to make sense of this. And so that way you would say that the unbeliever has a lot of basic beliefs or beliefs that are properly produced by a cognitive faculty reliably aimed at truth, etc., because God made us that way. Fine. But also the unbeliever has defeaters for his cognitive reliability because of his faulty metaphysics, but he does not realize that he has these defeaters or does not think through them. And were he think through them, would not have any knowledge, because then he would have all these defeaters for all his knowledge claims. So in principle, in an idealized consistent unbeliever, he would have no knowledge, but in fact, because he does not realize or does not see the implications of his metaphysical beliefs, he's not epistemologically self-conscious, as Van Til would say, therefore he can have knowledge. So I think this is a way that we can make sense of the Van Tilian claim that is palatable most contemporary philosophers.
So let me see if I get this right. So the part, the Plantinga component is like having this more modest outlook about epistemology, seeing that like, okay, well, maybe we can't prove Christianity absolutely, but what we can do is kind of reorient ourselves with this externalism, kind of see that, okay, well, it's not as if from any kind of means of making an argument that's even the primary way that we get knowledge in the first place. We tend to just kind of pick up knowledge based on the faculties that we come into the world with. And based on that kind of insight, we can add this other insight that, well, the difference between various metaphysical beliefs involves these defeaters, and we can still maintain to some agreement with Van Til, because when we look at unbelief, there are some particularly nasty defeaters for the alternative metaphysical systems that unbelief commits you to. Is that basically right?
Yeah. So another way to put it is that the unbelieving metaphysical systems have implications which undermine the reliability of human knowledge, with which you end up having no knowledge at all. And another point, I think he plays completely right about planning of epistemology. Maybe it's helpful for some people to think of it as like an innocent until proven guilty approach to our beliefs, right? So if you just start believing things in general, you should trust them unless you have reason not to. So this is why unbelievers have knowledge too, but the until proven guilty part is important as well. And the Christian apologist can then try to prove it guilty.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So it's kind of like, I like this. It's funny, I've used that analogy before too. It's like from Plantinga, we're taking that innocent until proved guilty approach, which is definitely to disagree with, I think, a more Van Tilian view of the noetic effects of sin. But then with Van Til, and maybe adding something to Plantinga, we're explaining some of the psychology of unbelief in a similar way that Van Til would explain it. Or we're specifically the concept of consistency. That's really at play. That like really the reason why, in terms of his internal criteria of reasoning, the reason why the unbeliever still has knowledge and can still reason very well, and might even be the world's greatest scientist at the time, is because he's inconsistent with, the metaphysical convictions that he maybe subconsciously or maybe consciously has at the time. Is that a good way of putting it, you think?
I think so. Another way that this can be helpful, I think, is that it gives a blueprint for the Plantillian or Plantingian philosopher to show how he could extend or present his critique of other worldviews, right? So there's this well worked out model of the feeders. You can show the metaphysical implications. There's a body of literature about this. There's something you can engage with and something in terms of which you can formulate your arguments. Because I think presuppositionalism in its present state kind of like, I feel like it kind of floats in empty space without any strong connections to hold on to in other systems or other, and it's not just views, but even like categories and terminologies. I feel like it's kind of difficult for presuppositionalists to communicate with people in other intellectual traditions, because their terminology is, the one hand, old, and the other hand, Van Til had this custom to redefine every term, to give it a new Christian meaning. But that, I think, makes communicating with other philosophical systems really difficult, and Plantinga's epistemology could be like a sort of a common ground terminologically.
That's very interesting. Do you think that that's just because? I'll be honest. To me, that seems to be kind of how do I put this? That seems to me almost a motif of more continentally influenced thought in general. Like if I think back to the existentialists and the idealists, Hegel and Kant themselves, the way they use terminology, you almost have to like learn you almost have to learn a new language, really, to try to pick up these philosophies. Whereas, like, if you're already, if you're going to a university in the West, or some university that has been influenced by more analytically involved philosophies, it seems like there's already, maybe not a universal terminology, but there's terms that are floating across the globe that have a pretty good anchor in the present contemporary conversation. Do you think that that's maybe something that's going on behind this, or do you think that it's in particular presuppositionalism and Plantinga, like those things themselves?
I think in general, if someone finds something, a continental philosopher that he thinks is worthy of being promoted, then it's a good service to try to translate that into analytic terminology, because it's often hard to do so. And that often makes continental philosophers inaccessible.
I see. Yeah. So okay. So you had this conviction that you could prove Christianity absolutely, and then this insight comes along to sort of relieve this crisis of faith that you're going through. But I think you've kind of moved on even from a synthesis of Van Til and Plantinga too. So how would you maybe critically analyze this paper that you put forward?
Well, I'm not sure what to say about the paper, because I don't say that anything in there is true. I only say that it's a nice synthesis of the two philosophers. I mean, you could try to synthesize Kant and Nietzsche and not expect that any of it will be true, but it can also still be a nice synthesis. Of course, I think there's enough stuff close to truth in it that it's worth writing up and publishing. So I don't think it's terrible stuff, but I don't agree with every detail. So, yeah, so as I said earlier, Plantinga is an externalist. He thinks that that knowledge is whether the conditions for knowledge are met are outside us, and we don't always know whether they are met or not. But I think that there has to be some part of epistemology that tells us how to think, right? And whether it involves a concept or knowledge or not, I don't care. But I think we should have some kind of normative conception of rationality that involves rules on how to think. And I think if we are externalists about even that, the rationality not just warrant, then there are just no rules on how to think. I think that's trouble. I think that's very close to relativism, even skepticism. So I think there has to be some internalist version or internalist aspect to our epistemology, which Plantinga, he doesn't ignore, but he kind of tries to brush it aside. Yeah, so therefore I think this very easy appeal to proper basicality doesn't work. You have to point to something internal to your consciousness or experience that justifies your belief. Now, belief in God can still be immediate in the sense that it is not based on arguments. There is no propositional evidence for it. But there still has to be non-propositional evidence for it, like experience or seeming or anything that you think that revelation induces in you. That can be non-propositional evidence for your belief. But I think that there has to be something of that sort at least.
Yeah, so it seems to me, if I'm looking at this with childlike eyes, like the word that comes to my mind is like a rule. It sounds like there has to be some kind of rule following, even if whether or not the rule is about inference. Whether it's rules of, it doesn't need to be rules of inference, because it doesn't need to be a set of propositions that's put into an argument. It could be like earlier you mentioned how you had this sense that Jesus was really there when you were praying. So that seems to me like you would want to say about that kind of experience that, hey, there's some kind of principle here why this counts as verifying Christianity. I don't know if you would want to put it that way, but so am I getting that idea right, that there has to be some kind of like some law about it, or some rule to follow for the evidence to really count as evidence or something like that?
Sure, but I don't think this has to be very exotic or anything. Like if you just say that there has to be some evidence there, that's already something. And I think actually that this gives a more realistic account of how people come to Christian faith than planning is. Like you don't come to faith with waking up one day and saying that, wow, I find myself believing that Christianity is true. Right? You usually have some thoughts and some experiences that surround your conversion, and that at least to some degree support or cause or undergird or strengthen your decision or your conversion or your faith. So I think introducing this internalist aspect is more faithful to Christian experience as well.
Yeah. So if I can try to put on a hat that I don't usually wear and speak for someone who is maybe more hardline aligned with an evidentialist or even a rationalist outlook, I think maybe one concern with this project is going to be, hey, if you open up the gates to that broad a view of evidence, how are we as Christians to sort of protect ourselves from and protect people who are young Christians, or try to help people who seem to be future converts? We're in the midst of talking with them, and maybe it looks like they're having a gradual turnover to the faith, but then something comes along and somebody says, well, I think this counts as evidence. And the rationalist or the evidentialist, I think, has some concern. How do we demarcate what kinds of evidence are going to be good versus what are going to be bad, in a way that's, on the one hand, kind of true to our Christian faith, or true to what we take to be these principles of evidence, but on the other hand still maintains what seems to be this really good insight that evidence can be a lot more than just arguments and proofs?
I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that something can be evidence only if it has some content that supports the thing, right? I think it ends up being a kind of a primitive notion eventually. I don't know. If you can give me an example, maybe I can give my thoughts on it.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think back to one. I remember spending a night with these Mormon missionaries. My friend and I were out in like 40, 50 degree weather. Looking back, I'm like, maybe we should have let those girls leave earlier than we did, because we spent hours out there talking with them. But they kept coming back to this idea that they had this, I think they called it like a burning in their bosom, burning in their stomach. There is this emotional feeling that they have that verifies their Mormon faith. And so I'm wondering how a Christian should a Christian, as we're trying to look at how to move, progress epistemologically and think as Christians about evidence, should a Christian think of that as evidence but then look for defeaters? Is that really like a viable evidential appeal? Or is that just not even a good way to justify or warrant your beliefs in the first place?
Well, I guess it depends on that experience, right? Like, why does he think or she think that burning in the bosom is in any way connected to the truth of Mormonism, right? Like, if they can give an account, then I suppose there is some evidence. the kind of epistemology that I'm now suggesting, which is sometimes called phenomenal conservatism. So on phenomenal conservatism, justification is very cheap. It's very cheap. Not difficult to get a justified belief. But of course, you then encounter with new evidence and also defeaters. So yeah, that would be one route. But I think we need to distinguish between two things here. One is, should I be worried now that there's evidence for Mormonism? It's one worry. And the other is, what do I say to this person to move them out of Mormonism? Right? These are two questions. And so to the first one, does this mean that there is evidence for Mormonism? I think if I have prior non-ad hoc reasons to think that experience is not reliable in some way or another is spurious, then it needn't worry me. And for the other, what do I tell this person to move them out of Mormonism? Then I think we just have to return back to the feeders, and these can be evidential as well. They needn't be so philosophical. It can be just facts about Mormon history and stuff like that.
Okay. Do you well, and maybe you think this is just an unescapable difficulty. I'm kind of curious about that. So I suppose you were having a conversation with a Mormon, and it turns out that maybe they don't even realize it, right? Maybe they're very naive and they're not very learned as you are regarding epistemology, but they keep doing what you can identify as something like a Morean shift. They will continually resort to this emotional experience they had as a better reason to be skeptical about the premises of your argument or the basic reasons that you try to give in support that counters Mormonism. Like when you make these historical extrapolations, for example, do you see that as something that in principle can be solved by this Christian phenomenal conservatism, or do you see that basically how would you respond to that? What do you think we can do about something like that?
I think impasses like that are possible, and the best we can do is like offer evidence. The best we can do philosophically is offer evidence and hope that it works, but there's no guarantee that it will. And I think there's biblical support for that. I mean, it's a bit scary, but there's a story in Jeremiah 44. Jeremiah tries to convince the people to turn from their idolatry and worship Yahweh because it is Yahweh's punishment that they had various troubles recently. The people respond, well, no, it's actually when we were worshiping Yahweh that we had various troubles, and we are fine now. And Jeremiah just says that God will judge you for this. So I think it's possible that sometimes we just end up in situations like this.
Yeah, interesting. So that's what I find fascinating about that is I think that most Christians I know are going to agree with you on that. It seems to me like that's a very popular, people will be more inclined to accept this phenomenal conservatism because it aligns with this idea that, yeah, I've come into conversations with people where it just seems like there's nothing more that we can be said. You know, we shake hands, we've given the best cases we can give, and we remain friends, but never really convinced each other. So maybe that is kind of a weakness of evidentialism, that it's looking for maybe not absolute proof, but kind of like a trump card in any conversation that you can possibly get in. How would you go about, what would you comment on that kind of evidentialist concern? Like, what would you say to an evidentialist, how he might be able to come to your side on these situations and see, the impasses are really not a threat to your Christian faith. It's not something that that serves as a defeater for that.
Well, I think one thing to say is that there's actually a biblical precedent for this. For example, my example from Jeremiah 44, and there may be others as well. The other is that there is some subjectivity to evidence assessment. Of course, if you get into like probability theory and stuff like that, there's always numbers, but those numbers are basically assigned out of thin air, right? So there is, ultimately we appeal to consciences, I think. And consciences are involved in being honest to one sees the evidence to say as well. And if someone just tries to insist that whatever is not evidence for Christianity or whatever is evidence for their own view, I think there comes a point when we cannot say anything to them. But to be honest, I think this is true for whatever position and whatever question and whatever approach we take. because otherwise most disagreements will end in consensus, and they don't.
Okay, all right. I gotta bug you I do want to ask you about epistemology of disagreement, and this seems like a really good segue into that. But for my own kind of concern, I'm curious to see how you respond. It seems to me that maybe we would agree, and maybe we would disagree. No, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that there's biblical precedent to think that. Well, actually, let me interrupt myself. So I very much like a lot of what you're doing epistemologically by making this very much in terms of people's personal commitments, and especially the fact that impasses are reached in conversation. That all seems to me to be very on board. It's clearly what happens. I can't list any verses, but it seems to me that happens in a lot of the prophets, where the people's hearts are just hardened by the prophetic calls to repent. But nevertheless, what does concern me is this idea also that's found in Scripture of man's answerability to God. It seems like, if I could find another place, I would, but I think like Romans 1 is maybe like the simplest example where Paul appeals to sort of the inescapability of God knowledge, God consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. There's this kind of inescapable sense of God that man has, and it's in virtue of that he has no excuse. Paul in his very courtroom style of thinking is like, when you go into the courtroom and God is judging you, you're not able to say, well, you weren't clear enough, not enough evidence, the way Russell did. God was very clear. So one thing that concerns me is it looks to me like there's an obstacle to that. It looks to me like one challenge that the unbeliever then has to God is to say, well, ultimately, because I have to draw one number out of thin air, there's no background information. There's no something godlike back of that I can appeal to that involves knowledge of you. I can start from whatever I want, or whatever seems to me to count as justified, and it looks to me like from there that you could potentially build an entire epistemological scheme that has excluded the possibility of evidence for God from the outset. That's like my worry. What would you say to that concern?
I want to recommend a paper to our listeners. Its title is Reforming Reformed Epistemology, a New Take on the Sensus Divinitatis. It's written by Blake McAllister and Trent Doherty. And what they do is present an interpretation of basically Romans 1 that's put in terms of phenomenal conservatism. And so what they have to say, and I think they are right, is that sensus divinitatis is basically the sort of faculty that by which we realize the evidential support between the created world and the existence of God. So we perceive the created world objectively. The created world evidentially supports the existence of God. By this faculty we have, we implicitly grasp that it is indeed evidence for the existence of God with great confidence. And of course, how aware exactly people are of this, or how much they suppress it, or how honest with it probably differs from individual to individual. But I think this is the general idea. So the sensus divinitatis would produce seemings that all this is evidence for God and that God exists, but not just purely basically in the Plantingian sense, but in a way that it is non-inferentially justified by the fact that the created realm is evidence for God.
Interesting. Okay, well, when you get into conversations about this with people, you're going to have to bring up some of these concepts, and people have different expertise on these issues, and that might give you call to question the concepts that you brought up. It seems to me like that is something like what I take to be what's the word? Maybe the impetus for consideration of epistemology of disagreement. How would you define that, and what do you think is like a good reason for starting to look at some of the concepts of that kind of epistemological take?
The epistemology of disagreement, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. One reason to look into the epistemology of disagreement is if you want to be humble, and if you want not to think that you're always the smartest person in the room. Because if you are not, You have to figure out what to do with other people's opinions. Like, if you are always the smartest person in the room, then you can always just say that they're just too dumb to say that you're right. In other cases, if you don't want to think that, then you will have to try to think carefully about what to do when people who you think are at least as smart as you are and are aware of the arguments and evidence on the given matter, at least to the degree that you are, disagree with you. There's this very common case, this kind of a thought experiment or a story that illustrates this. It goes like this. Suppose that you and your friends go out to a restaurant and eat, and at the end, there's maybe 11 of you, and you get the bill of $280, and you agree that you split the bill and you add 20% as a tip. So you and your friends both do the calculations in your head, and you both know about each other that you've done this a number of times, and generally you have the equal likelihood of getting the calculation right. Then you come up with $30 per person, and your friend comes up with $32 per person. At this point, does the fact that you learn about your friend's calculation give you reason to doubt your original result? So almost everyone thinks intuitively that of course it does if you think he's equally likely to get it right. And so that's the basic issue of the epistemology of disagreement. And of course you can add persons who you think are not just equally as likely to get it right as you are, but more likely to get it right, and so on and so on. And you just have to figure out what to do about this. One big camp is called conciliationism. Conciliationism says that if someone's your intellectual equal and you disagree, then you should kind of meet in the middle, like calculate an average of your confidence levels and both adopt that. The other end of the spectrum is like complete steadfastness is what it's called, which tries to argue that as many cases as possible, you just get to ignore that and just keep your original stance. And so this is the basic outline of the issue.
Yeah, I have to say that if you are drawn like me to an outlook on evidence that's very person-oriented, and so tends to think of the evidences we come up with as very, very influenced by report and testimony, then I find this a very appealing way to look at the kinds of things that shape, how confident you can really be about your beliefs. I think it's funny you use the mathematical example because there's an area where, if somebody probably disagrees with me about mathematics, I'm almost certainly wrong. So, how would you, this whole conversation is a great example of that, right? Like both you and I have some serious commitments we share. We both think Jesus is God. We both think the Bible is the Word of God. Those are really big, right? Those have huge gravitas for your epistemology. But we disagree about all these other things. And so what can we do with this insight that you're talking about, this spectrum of different ways of dealing with disagreement? What can we do with that to try to help Christians? For me, I'm thinking of passages from Paul where he keeps telling us to be united, united, united. What can we do with that toward that end?
I think one of the best things to do is just recognize. So this helps us recognize when there are irrelevant influences shaping our beliefs, right? You just think about the list of things you believe and think about how many of those are both controversial and you started believing them back in your childhood, right? Whatever, about politics, about religion, about anything. For me, there are plenty of such beliefs. So beliefs that are both controversial and you started believing them in your childhood. I think we should take a long, hard look at beliefs like this, because these are probably not the most reliably produced beliefs, or not the most rationally produced beliefs. And if of course these beliefs are the ground of disunity, as you said, disagreement and even perhaps harm, then we should try to work out what we should actually think about it.
Yeah, well, I think of doctrinal issues. We were talking about Calvinism before, right? So surely both of us have a number of experiences where you brought up in the conversation, right, how people have very unhealthy takeaways from Calvinism, and that surely that has led to dissidence in the church. And so, how would you begin reason? You mentioned the spectrum between like conciliationism. I think hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, and steadfast epistemology. How would you reason about where we should line up on the spectrum, and what would you put forward if you have an idea of some kind of methodology for maybe helping Christians find a way for being more respectful and more humble about these irrelevant informants of our beliefs, and the way it seems like you were implying, like, hey, we can be kind of prideful about our own instincts. We can be kind of, yeah. What would you say about that, like moving forward?
I think one thing is that you should probably expect, if you meet an intelligent person disagree with you, and you have like elementary objections, they have probably already thought about those, and they usually they're likely to have some story to tell about that. So I think it's usually naive when we think we have a one proof text in the Bible that settles a centuries-long debate. Because guess what? Theologians on both sides have read the Bible. I don't think there's any. So if I could just tell you how we could all come to an agreement, then there probably wouldn't be this whole centuries of disagreement. But I think one thing is that we should respect people of other opinions, and we should assume that they are, of course, if they are informed people, they have probably thought about it as well. On the other hand, I think it's helpful if we can determine, or we can isolate the things that we disagree about. Because, for example, if a Calvinism-Arminianism debate ends up like not being resolvable because the Arminian is committed to this philosophical and emotional assumption that true love is incompatible with determinism, and you really find no reason to believe that, and he can give no reason either. Moreover, you see that the Bible supports your position. If we leave this one thing out of the picture, then I think you can suspect that the other person has a kind of rational motivation as well. So I think it often comes down to what degree do we have the same evidence and reasons that we are familiar with? Have we both understood those? If yes, then do we have core assumptions that we disagree about? If not, then I think we should just increase our confidence and try to work out what it is that we should believe. Like, for example, if I just say that there are 2 cases of speaking in tongues in Acts, and you tell me that there are 4 cases of speaking in tongues in Acts, and either of us have read Acts in the past month, we're both generally equally familiar with the book of Acts, then I think we should both decrease our confidence. Or if my church teaches annihilationism, it doesn't, but suppose it does, and suppose also that your church teaches eternal conscious torment. Also suppose that neither of us have thought a lot about it, and just adopted our church's position, and we find this out, then I think we should decrease our confidence, because it's just by someone's testimony, equal testimony, that we believe what we believe. So I think we should, in these cases, try to find what our disagreements boil down to, and what our sources and presuppositions are for our disagreement, and then go from there. So if we can find a presupposition that we feel like we're in an asymmetrical position, like I'm in a better position for whatever reason with respect to that presupposition, then I maybe can be steadfast. If we are in a very similar position in all respects and just disagree, then I think there's usually a good reason to be less confident and even try to find the truth together.
Yeah. So, okay, so this seems very good. Maybe a concern that a Christian listener might have who's thinking about apologetic scenarios, and he gets into a conversation. This seems to me to happen all the time, where, because I think of myself when I was a teenager and even through my college years, and surely pride is still a huge problem for me, and will be throughout my entire life, but especially in the past, I remember having conversations with people who were just vastly my superior on scientific information, on biology and cosmology and these things, and I would try to get into arguments with them about the scientific data and certain models that were constructed over these issues. Surely that's foolishness, but a concern might be, hey, if I'm a Christian and I'm trying to have a conversation with people, and I'm I grew up in a hodunk town, and I don't really know much about anything in these high cerebral areas of thought. I'm just a farmer, but I still want to contend for my faith. How does this not make it difficult, if not impossible, for me to have an apologetic conversation? Like, how can I be an evangelist and defend my faith, knowing that, hey, everybody else is an expert about almost everything I'm disagreeing with?
Right. That's a good question. So I think one way actually that might help is, I think this can be this can be overcomplicated, right? I'm always weirded out when apologetics sessions advertise themselves by telling you why you believe. Oh, like, only I know why I believe, and God knows, and you don't know why I believe. You can tell me further reasons to believe what I already believe. It's already a settled fact why I believe. So I think maybe if people don't have any extreme interest or education or both, they can just tell why they believe, right? Because it's obviously faith that God has wrought in them, so that will have some appeal, at least ought to have some appeal. And the other hand, I think if they start to try to out-science the scientist, out-philosophize the philosopher, that might end up being more of an embarrassment than anything edifying. Further point that might be helpful is to know for such people that experts disagree as well. So it's not like the other side has like won the day when it comes to intellectual battles. But I don't think everyone is called to fight these battles.
Okay. That's interesting. Do you think then I want to come back to the question I just asked, but do you think one takeaway is that maybe some people shouldn't be apologists? Or is that too strong?
Depends on what you mean by apologist.
That's true. Let me disambiguate. So do you think some people should avoid conversations in which they try to make argument or convince other people of their faith?
Probably not, but I mean, I think it's adequate if for some people it's only stuff like their testimony, their experiences of answered prayer, what they personally see as unconvincing in other faiths. And of course, they can always learn more about this. But I think that we can outdo other scholars in their field of study just because we are Christian.
That's very interesting. I wondered if you. So this is very interesting to me because it seems like a common theme that I see, the sort of trend of Bálint's various synthesis and movements through these philosophies is that you very much appreciate modesty, and so I'm using your terminology here because I'm not trying to be either positive or negative in my assessment of this. But it's like, to use your terminology from earlier, it's like a lowering of the bar. So before, like with Plantinga, there was like a lowering of the bar of like internal criteria, and then even in the Van Til Plantinga synthesis, there's still kind of a lowering in the bar with kind of doing away with Van Til's notion of absolute proof, which you may think is more Bonson, but whatever. And here there's kind of a lowering of the bar even of like what constitutes the priorities or norms of good apologetics. Is like, hey, even if you can just give your testimony, that's good enough for God.
I think you're right about this trajectory, but I think what I'm ending up with at this point, it's much closer to what less philosophically oriented faithful Christians have been doing all along.
Yeah, I even though we have our disagreements, I really do appreciate some of the insights here. I think that's basically right. That what I really appreciate about your take is the bringing in of evidences that are. It's as if the philosophical and apologetic atmospheres can be kind of condescending, dismissive even of things that we as human beings use on an everyday scale as evidences or reasons to act a certain way or whatever. And I really do appreciate, and it seems to me like you said earlier, hey, there's kind of biblical precedent for that.
Yeah. And I just want to say that I definitely think that there are people who are called to do all of these sorts of scientific and philosophical things on the highest level. But I think it's fairly obvious that not everyone is. And I think that those who aren't are probably better to operate based on what they know rather than the partial and probably false information they've gleaned from unreliable sources. So I don't think you should argue with a professor of biology on evolution based on 2 creationist videos you've seen. And this is, of course, caricature, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you know what, I would say I wish that were a caricature, but unfortunately there are too many people. And I raised my hand as a person who would do that sort of thing when I was younger, and that's very unfortunate.
I think this probably is true for all of us.
Yeah, as a Christian, if there's any good testimony for what you called this trajectory of thought, it's the guilt you feel when you look back and say, "Wow, hey, I kind of committed that intellectual sin a lot." So yeah, I like that. If I could maybe just very briefly return to that former question before maybe wrapping up here, because I know you don't have all day.
Okay.
So the question was something like, hey, for people who want to do apologetics, who want to be able to defend their faith, but they're just not a cerebral thinker. They're maybe very good at the tasks that they do on a daily basis. Maybe they're like a machinist or something, right? And they care for their family. They're a very good Christian, a good standing member of their church, all this stuff. But they're not an intellectual in any perceived cultural notion of that, what that means. And so now they've gotten in a conversation with someone who knows more than them. Maybe they're a doctor or something in some field. And the concern is, if that doctor who studied philosophy or biology or other stuff has these objections to Christianity, doesn't that, if there's no qualification for this kind of epistemology of disagreement, doesn't that, on the face of it, count as a right of that person to kind of silence the Christian, or at least as a reason for the Christian to reduce his confidence in his faith?
I'm very glad you raised that. I think not, and the reason why is that the Christian should believe that with respect to the truth of Christianity, he is in a better epistemic position than the unbelieving professor, because that's what the Bible teaches, right? That unbelievers, for spiritual reasons, don't see or don't admit, or both, that God exists and the various truths about him. So I think if a Christian already believes this, then he meets a non-Christian who doesn't believe Christianity or doesn't believe in God, then there's nothing new, right? He already expected that to happen. And the reason for this is that Christianity and maybe the secular spirit of the age postulates different epistemic standards or credentials that help one find out the truth about Christianity, right? What does Christianity say? You have to be humble. More importantly, you have to be born again to see the truth. That's not the same as being fair with the evidence and rigorous and studying everything critically. These are, in general, intellectual virtues, of course, but our spiritual state with respect to the truth of Christianity is such that those and only those who have been born again are in a situation where they are reliable in that. So this is, of course, from the Christian perspective. It follows that there is, from a neutral perspective, there is absolutely no information, right, about who is in a better situation. And if there's absolutely no information about who is in a better situation from a neutral perspective, then I don't think that one has to decrease his confidence.
That's very interesting. So that sounds like, is to someone listening, I can imagine a listener thinking, oh, isn't that what Craig says when he appeals to the illuminating or convicting work of the Spirit? Or I think of another listener who maybe has more Ventilian outlook saying, oh yeah, that kind of sounds like the conviction of the word on a regenerate believer, that like, it's sola scriptura, more or less. But I'm curious how you would... Yeah, I bring that up because I'm curious how you would kind of relate to those doctrines of... Because that sounded very reformed to me, what you were saying.
Actually, I would tie it to the noetic effects of sin and regeneration. Because if you're a Christian, you believe that you have been regenerated, and also believe that unbelievers are heavily influenced by the noetic effects of sin. And from these two, it follows that you're in a better epistemic position than they are.
Okay. Now, Bálint, before we go, you must permit me to snark. I thought regeneration was the exegetically empty cousin of prevenient grace. That's what I thought regeneration was.
What you're referring to is what I said about the thesis that regeneration precedes faith, regeneration itself.
Okay. I got you.
Well, that's a failed attempt to snarge me, but you can cut it out for the final version.
No, I think it's funny to leave it in. But yeah, okay, cool. Can you maybe, because I'm terrible with names, is it possible that we could get some of your writings on the recording here, just listed, so people can look you up?
My publications, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. I have one paper that's called Van Til versus Stroud is the transcendental argument for God, for Christian theism or something like that viable? ? And that was published in Theologica in 2018. I have a new paper which is available online but still officially forthcoming. That's called, what is it? I don't know either, just give me a moment. It's Knowledge and the Fall in American Neo-Calvinism towards a Van Til Plantinga synthesis. And that's officially going to appear next year in Philosophia Reformata.
Perfect. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, there's with respect to epistemology of disagreement, rather, I think our relationship to me is like one of the best cases where I think that has done me good. It's like, man, if Bálint disagrees with me on something, I really gotta make sure that I've got all my horses in a row, because this is not a person who easily comes to wrong ideas about this stuff, or at least stuff that I'm not convinced by. So
flattery is a sin, Jimmy.
I appreciate you coming on, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.